Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and today I'd like to talk to you about Socrates and the beginnings of the tradition of Western ethics in ancient Greece. Before I get into some exploration of the life and ideas of Socrates, I'd like to develop for you a little bit of historical context. Perhaps you've heard people say that Western civilization, that tradition, which develops primarily around the Mediterranean basin in northern Africa, the Middle East, and southern Europe, and is related to that tradition. That tradition of Western civilization owes a lot to some things that happen in ancient Greece. And I'm going to develop that case a little bit. I'm fairly convinced by that, but at the same time, I do want to add that what we're talking about here is as one city-state in a peninsula that we think of as Greece today, that sits very sort of importantly placed in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And given that placement, and particularly given the Athenian focus on trade and the strength of their sort of seafaring capabilities and their navy, the Athenians were very well placed to sort of be a crossroads of many of the ancient cultures. And so I don't want to be thought of as sort of saying, these, giant brained human beings just born in this one place are responsible for all these things I'm going to talk about today. I think it's really more complicated than that. But at the same time, it's often interesting to get to know a subject by learning a fairly simplified sketch of it. And so I want to sketch for you today the rise of Athens as a power about 2,500 years ago in the Axial Age moment, and how that gives rise to the emergence of philosophy, and particularly the emergence of the Western tradition in ethical philosophy, which is our focus in this course. So about 2,500 years ago, there was a very large economic, social, and military power that came out of the Middle East and extended all the way over into the Indian subcontinent, sort of centered around what we would think of as Mesopotamia, and that was the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire extended out of the Middle East as far as maybe the coast of Turkey, what we would call the coast of Turkey today, often called Ionia in that ancient period that we're going to be talking about there. And I'm going to, again, I'll try to not go into too much detail here, but I find this history pretty interesting. There were some city-states on the coast of Turkey in Ionia there, called the Ionian city-states, that for a complicated set of reasons revolted against Persian control. And so the Ionian revolt set in motion a kind of a military response, both in terms of land forces and naval forces on the part of the Persians, that they would mobilize out of the Mesopotamian basin, bringing a huge army and very powerful navy over to the area that had revolted in Ionia. And so during that time frame, there was a debate in the Greek peninsula about how to deal with or respond to, or whether to deal with or respond to this at all. The Ionian city-states, while they were under Persian control, were culturally much more connected to the city-states on the peninsula that we call Greece today. Let's just go ahead and dispense with that. We'll just call it the Greek peninsula, even though it wasn't called that at the time. And so this cultural connection just right across the Aegean between the Greek city-states and the Ionian city-states, gave some cause for the Greek city-states to consider whether or not to be involved in defending the Ionian city-states against the Persian response to this revolt. Now, I think part of the consideration militarily may have also been the realization that the Persians wouldn't militarize all the way to the edge of the edge of Turkey and bring their navy all this way, and then not perhaps try to expand their control. So many Greek city-states, including famously Sparta and Athens, saw reason to get involved. And, you know, maybe you're familiar with the movie 300. You know, that's a bit of an older movie now, but it's pretty memorable, and you know, somewhat obviously cartoonized in its visual depiction, but the history isn't so far off there that you know, depicts a stand, you know, by a small number of Spartan ground forces that really bought some key time for the other Greek forces to sort of get out of the way, in effect, of the Persian forces, which then did, I think, sweep through the Greek peninsula at some point. But meanwhile, they were able to get out of the way, so they survived. And then when they eventually sort of hit back, it was kind of a combination of Greek collaborative ground forces and also naval battles that went in the direction of the Greeks. And it was a huge sort of underdog victory. And it pushed back the Persians and ended any hopes of Persian expansion. And so in the short run, what that did is it, you know, sort of sent the Spartans back to Sparta, because they were, I would guess maybe one way to put it is, fairly isolationist in their cultural leanings. But the Athenians, as I mentioned, were very much about trade, and they were very involved in seagoing trade, and they had a very powerful navy. And now, in some sense, the Athenian navy was the sea power in the Eastern Mediterranean, briefly. And this gives rise to what we call the golden age of Athens. It's an economic boom. And, you know, they formed a trade league called the Delian Trade League for a while, and then eventually just sort of took it over, moving the treasury of the Delian Trade League from the Isle of Delos to Athens itself. And you get a lot of the architectural developments that are very famous during this period of time on the Acropolis are developed during this period of time. Meanwhile, within the centuries preceding this golden age, the Athenians had engaged in some pretty interesting cultural experiments. Namely, one big one that we should talk about a couple of times throughout the course would be democracy itself, what I would call democracy 1.0. As far as we know, it's invented there. Let's not romanticize it. It was, you know, Athenian males with property, you know, so it was sexist, it was classist, it was ethnocentric, racist in a sense, just like democracy 2.0 in the United States when it starts, if we're honest, right? But still, this is a major experiment in human culture and what we'll call political philosophy in this class. And so they invented democracy. They also invented, it would seem, what we would call like trial by jury. And while there'll be significant adaptations of trial by jury in the modern era, you know, this is also an Athenian invention. And in the period of the Golden Age, after Persian expansion had been ended, there was just a lot of power and money at stake. And so success in the assembly halls of Athenian democracy and success in the courtrooms of the Athenian trial by jury system became that much more important, with that much power, social, political, and economic power at stake. And so what emerged in this period of time were a new kind of set of professionals that we call collectively the sophists. And the sophists were sophisticated. I think that's where we get that word sophisticated from, is from the Greek sophist. They were well-traveled, they were well-read, and they emerged as the first ever professional tutors. Okay, of course there were teachers who taught practical skills at this level of civilization 2,500 years ago. Obviously there were places to learn things from professional teachers. However, the sophists specialized in something that had never really been taught before, which was sort of the art of thought itself. Maybe more specifically, it would be the art of communication. And then, you know, to talk about sort of what's going to end up giving the sophists a little bit of a darker reputation is that this focus on teaching, thinking well, reading well, writing well, and communicating well ends up also being oftentimes a focus on the sort of dark arts of persuasion, rhetoric, what we sometimes call sophistry, I think is a better word for this sort of notion of the dark arts of persuasion. Meaning, look, you can try to convince somebody of something logically, and that is, I think, the best we can hope for many times in communication. But there are many ways to try to convince somebody of something without logic, with appeals to emotion, with appeals to fear, with clever tricks of language, with the intentional use of what we call fallacies, sort of mistakes of reasoning as forms of manipulation. And so some of the sophists became somewhat infamous for their ability to teach us how to win any argument, no matter what the argument is, no matter what position they're given. And so this gave some of the sophists kind of a darker reputation. Let's also just highlight that this is kind of a big moment in the history of human culture, because when the first ever professional intellectuals, because that's what they amount to, the first ever professional intellectuals emerge in the form of the sophists here in ancient Athens, this in some sense begins a process of what we will see expand again in the modern era, of what we might call the democratization of education itself. Most education, particularly literacy, would be reserved for a priest class or those born to that privilege. But in some sense, during this golden age moment in the 4th century in ancient Athens, between the end of the Persian Wars and the beginning of the Peloponnesian conflict between Athens and Sparta, this golden age with so much sort of economic power generated within Athens, it allowed, like, if you could pay, now you can play. So in some sense, we begin to separate in that moment culturally education from birthright. Now it's still going to be connected to money, right? But that's going to be the opening up in some sense in the future, in the modern era, where you get the rebirth of the classical, particularly a lot of things from ancient Greece, the rebirth and the Renaissance that gives rise to the Enlightenment and much of what we think of as the modern in Western culture. All these experiments are going to sort of resurface and expand. So just sort of keep that in mind as we go forward. Certainly we'll see democracy 2.0 and trial by jury 2.0 and the democratization of education 2.0. We're going to see the study of the natural world 2.0. We'll get there when we talk more about Aristotle in a later lecture. But here I'm developing for you the emergence of the sophists, and I've given you some sense of a part of the cultural advancement that the sophists represent in some sense. But I've also maybe given you some sense, right, for the dark side or the darker side of the reputation that the sophists develop. In some respects, the sophists would become associated with a view that is tied to your reading for this lecture, and it's tied to a notion that we would call cultural relativism. And particularly with regard to our field of study, ethics, cultural relativism is the idea that value systems, particularly moral value systems, but also maybe this notion that we've connected to ancient ethics of how to get the most out of life, what makes for a really good, sort of the best of life itself. So morality and the best of life and what means success in life, according to cultural relativism, is simply defined by a cultural tradition. Now, when I say it that way, a lot of particularly 21st century young minds are going to be drawn to this notion, and I understand it. And we're going to talk more about relativism later in the term, because I think it's really important to wrestle with it in a more detailed way. I just sort of want to warn you about something right now as you think about these ideas. Cultural relativism not only says that morality and notions of a good life are determined by cultural traditions, it goes beyond that to say, and that's all there ever could be with regard to moral values and values of what's important in life. And the implication there, right, is that any cultural tradition is in some sense totally equal to any other cultural tradition. That when you're in culture A and you act accordingly, you're doing the right thing. But if you go in culture B and you act according to culture A, you're now wrong. And that means that even if culture A is, let's say, egalitarian and tolerant and believes in freedom of thought and freedom of speech, albeit maybe in imperfect ways, but at least touts these principles, if you take the behaviors from culture A and you go to culture B, which may be intolerant and sort of absolutist in its in a kind of a constrictive and coercive and classist and racist and sexist way, and if you behave according to culture A within culture B, you're just wrong. And that's where ethical relativism really stops being a very intriguing idea. I mean, it's intriguing as a description, right, of how we are all brought into a way of seeing the world through our enculturation. That much is really understandable. But cultural relativism as a position in the history of ethics about morality and about a good life doesn't stop there. It goes on to say, and that's all there ever is. Now, because the sophists had a penchant, some of them, for offering this kind of capacity to win any argument, they're going to develop a reputation for not really being aligned to any value structure, and in some sense then become associated with what we will call this idea of relativism in ethics. And if you're an Athenian, right, especially in this moment of the golden age where you feel like you're on top of the world, you're probably going to think that the Athenian gods, the Greek gods, especially Athena, right, and the ways of life that are associated with the Athenian tradition are not only right, but they're superior, right? And that your ability to sort of dominate the world in this moment of the golden age and impose your will, which will eventually get the Athenians in trouble, especially with the Spartans. But this idea that you could impose your will on the others is somehow going to be seen as evidence for the rightness of Athenian culture. And so there's going to be a little bit of a tension between maybe more traditionally minded Athenians, maybe more conservative minded Athenians who adhere to, traditional Greek religion and traditional Greek culture, and particularly the Athenian expression of that, and these new professional sophists who are going to be associated with cultural relativism. And so there's a little tension there. The sophists represent a kind of an advancement in a way, but they also represent a little bit of a threat because of their willingness to serve whatever position on the part of some of them, right? The willingness to sort of sell literally their services into the defense of whatever position. I'd invite you to think of the way in which sophistry and the sophists are very much in some ways alive today, particularly in advanced capitalist societies. I want you to maybe ask yourself, where are the sophists today? In what segments of the economy do we see sophists selling the services of a kind of a more nuanced and clever approach to the mind and the way in which we use the mind and language to change the minds of others? If I put it to you that way, I'm really hoping that you can see that there's probably at least 3 segments of the economy where sophistry is still very much allowed and encouraged and rewarded. One, maybe obviously, maybe first would be within the court system, and that would be the lawyers. I think that it's easy to bash the lawyers, right? And maybe some lawyers deserve it if they take money from people they know to be sort of bad people. But I want to also, be charitable here to the form of sophistry that's practiced in the legal system in the form of lawyers. I mean, the best we've ever come up with, right, in our trial by jury systems to this day is something along the lines of, you give me the facts, and you give my opponent the facts, and I will spin the facts as hard as I can in the direction of my client, and they will spin the facts as hard as they can in the direction of their client or the state or whatever the trial structure is. And then the jury will decide who's got the better spin on the facts. The sophistry is kind of built into it. It's part of the rules. I mean, when the lawyer has the the client dress in a certain outfit, that outfit doesn't speak to your actual guilt or innocence, right? I mean, that outfit is all about how you appear to the jury. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the sophistry that's often involved. And so, on the one hand, we might, and we often make sort of jokes at the expense of lawyers. I just want you to consider, it's an interesting sort of tangent of thought, that's the best we've ever come up with for approximating justice. And it's clearly not a perfect system. And it's clearly impacted to this day by money. If you can hire a better sophist, if you can hire a better lawyer, if you can have on retainer, right, a team of lawyers all the time, that is unfortunately kind of a tipping of the balance in a way of the justice system. And I think that, to this moment, we're still trying to figure out how to remedy that, or perhaps more realistically, how to minimize the impact of money in the justice system. But that's very much one of these extensions of sophistry born out of ancient Athens into this contemporary moment. There's one segment of the economy where we would still find the sophists. I'd say there's another one that's fairly obvious, and that would be in the world of politics. And a lot of times my students guess, well, the politicians. And I think, well, yes, at the lower levels, the politicians do have to be their own sophists, and maybe the more successful are better sophists. And but I would say at the higher levels, when power, economic, political, social power is really at stake, say at the federal level in something as gigantic as the United States, well, then it's not the politician, that's the sophist. The politician is sort of the face and the deliverer of the message. But the politician has a team of sophists, right, that run the campaigns and that manage the message of the politician. That's how serious this is, and that's how realistic, this notion of sophistry in the modern world is. That's how the system works, right? And here's another one where, we're not quite sure how to deal with money and its somewhat corrupting influence. On the one hand, me being able to spend my money to promote my ideas is an extension of free speech, and that, that's come out in recent Supreme Court decisions. On the other hand, me being able to form a super PAC and anonymously spend millions of dollars to hire sophists to irrationally persuade people against their own interests, boy, I hope that one of you out there can figure out how we can do a little bit better than that, And so there's a second place where the sophists have left their mark and continue to leave their mark. Sophistry is still present in not only the legal system, but also in politics. And there's one other, maybe you can think of it, but I would say it's in marketing. It's in advertising, clearly. Kind of a specialty of advertising, right, is to be able to persuade people and to maybe, to put a finger on something that's a challenge in our late stage capitalist society. It's one thing to sell people a good product, and to convince them with a good advertisement that you have a good product at a good price point. It's another thing to manufacture desire, to manufacture need, right? To manufacture consent, to quote the title of a famous book. It's no accident, right, that the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who brings us a kind of an awareness of many of the unconscious forces which drive human beings, that the nephew of Sigmund Freud would come to the United States in the early 20th century and write one of the really important early books on marketing, shaping, I think, much of 20th century marketing in the United States and in the West. Okay, so the sophists are a big deal, and the sophists represent a kind of a new, we might say slightly more cynical idea of morality that we called cultural relativism. This is going to be one of the big ideas of the course that we need to wrestle with, and we will later in the modern era, we're going to come back to relativism, focusing on relativism at the individual level, often called subjectivism. But also dealing at the same time with this cultural level relativism that I've introduced to you today. Now, within the context of all of this, we're going to see the emergence of the figure that we've probably all heard of, and that is Socrates, who was born, as far as we can tell, in about 470 and lived all his life in Athens, and died in 399, actually by public execution, by execution that was condoned by a public trial. And so I want to tell you a kind of a version of the life and death of Socrates that's going to set the stage for us in our exploration of ancient ethics in the West, for sure, but in many ways sets the stage really for the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition. There were what we would call, philosophers that had emerged, particularly in the northeastern Mediterranean region, around the 6th century BC, 7th century, 6th century before zero. They're often referred to somewhat dismissively as the pre-Socratic philosophers, the philosophers that come before Socrates, as if, Socrates is really the important one. I think in some sense that's fair. Socrates' story has become the story that launched, almost all the traditions that we know of as Western philosophy in some sense. But there were these earlier philosophers, and some of the reason why we don't talk about them very much is that not many of their writings survive. But one of the other reasons why we don't talk about them quite as much is that they were, the pre-Socratics, as far as we can tell from their surviving writings, really focused on metaphysics. They were really focused on the question of the nature of reality. And Socrates, what he's going to do is turn our attention toward the idea of what it means to live a good life. And I just want to come out on this point that, to me, in some ways, ethics, right, especially as it focuses on this question of what does it mean to live a good life, sort of broadly understood as including both what is the best of life and how do you be a good person. To me, this is one of the most practical and interesting and intriguing areas of philosophy's history, for sure. Obviously, political philosophy, which also, emerges here in ancient Athens, particularly in the work of Plato, and then under, more so under Aristotle, taken forward under the thinking of Aristotle. That's a very practical area of philosophy to this day as well. But ethics is the one that really intrigues me the most. And in some ways, the history of Western ethics goes back to Socrates, because here's what we think we know about Socrates. And I say we think we know. Anytime we're talking about somebody from thousands of years ago, whether it's Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad or Confucius or Lao Tzu or Socrates, we ought to have a little humility about what we say. We ought to have some awareness about what are our sources. And in this case, the sources on the life of Socrates primarily are people who seem to have loved Socrates. So let's keep that in mind. Number one will be Plato, and number two, a close second, maybe not so close, really, not so many surviving writings, would be a guy named Xenophon, who maybe served in the military with Socrates and wrote a version of what happened at his trial, so a version of what will be called the Apology. We also hear, a number of other Greek and Roman sources talk, without firsthand knowledge of Socrates. But, frankly, again, that's true of somebody like a Jesus in particular. So much of the New Testament is written by Paul, and Paul never met Jesus, right? And so many of the teachings of Jesus are attributed to, the writers of the four Gospels. But, those original four disciples never wrote anything, actually, as far as we can tell, that was written down many, many decades later. So again, we should always have a humility about these ancient sources. With that said, we're not so concerned here with history just for history's sake. We do some history to establish context for ideas. I think that helps us to understand ideas. I think it also helps us maybe get a deeper philosophical point, which is that ideas need to respond to historical context, particularly when it comes to philosophy and the search for wisdom. I would argue that one of the reasons why philosophy deals with the open-ended questions for which there are no once and for all answers is that we're seeking wisdom that is absolutely required, but wisdom about a certain moment of existence that is in some ways new, right? And so I often develop historical context for for both the direct reason of helping us to understand ideas and, like sophistry, for example, and the emergence of Socrates within the golden age of Athens, but also to sort of indirectly begin to develop this idea that philosophy itself, in some sense, is an ongoing tradition. Let's hope. I'm arguing that it should be an ongoing tradition and continue to expand. And I've said that it's recent, but maybe it should be less rare. Maybe we should democratize philosophy. We don't need everybody to do philosophy. We certainly don't need everybody to be PhD professors of philosophy. But if we're going to make democracy a little bit more interesting, and even the marketplace of ideas generally a little bit more interesting, it might be very valuable to have a larger number of people philosophically awakened to their own cultural biases and lenses and having them sort of rethinking it. And our strategy here is to sort of present some ideas from history to allow you, as the student of philosophy and ethics, to rethink what you think by comparing and contrasting what you think with these giants of history. Most people, right, have never sort of dug into their own assumptions about existence. Some have. But if we wrestle with the giants of history, we have the opportunity to sort of really maybe dramatically improve the nuance, the sophistication that we bring to our own ideas. And one of my big arguments in this ethics course is that in and of itself may be an important experiment in enriching democracy and enriching our lives. The quality of our community, the quality of our culture, and the quality of our individual lives, which are all, I would say, interrelated. And so, I wanted to develop for you a little bit of history, and I wanted to develop a little bit of history for the emergence of Socrates, right? So you got Socrates coming into this, this Athenian golden age. You got a guy that was maybe trained as a stonemason. He served in the military. Most people think that, as all Greek males, able-bodied Greek males did, but somebody who served very admirably, we think. But he's most famous for hanging out in public spaces like the main market, the agora of ancient Athens. And again, whether this is historically accurate or not is in some sense not the point, because these are the stories of his life and the ideas that are going to go on to shape for later ideas, right? These are the ideas that have been deemed sort of important and lasting. So we get to wrestle with these ideas. It's secondary, I would say, whether or not these are actually historically accurate and to what level of detail do we know them. That's sort of the realm of history for history's sake. We're doing any history we're doing just for philosophy's sake, right? Like we're developing some ideas from history in order to wrestle with the giants of history, in order to wrestle with some of the most influential ideas of history, in order to improve our own thinking, right? And by confronting the figure of Socrates, man, you are really being invited into the tradition in an interesting way. So Socrates hung out, we think, in the public space of the agora, and he becomes very famous for engaging in conversations that in some sense drew crowds, right? Like this was before, the internet age, right? This was before movies, this was before television. This was a time in which, frankly, the arts of conversation were more celebrated and more appreciated. And it would seem as if Socrates, who was in many ways kind of a funny character, right? He was often barefoot, often unwashed, as far as we know, didn't really care much about his personal appearance, was sort of famously unattractive by Athenian cultural standards, to the point of being described as funny looking by many people. So he was like atypical, right, as a character, and yet he had a kind of a genius, apparently, for conversation. And in a culture that valued that kind of ability and skill, this funny looking older guy named Socrates, who engaged in these very public conversations, became a kind of a rock star of sorts, but in many ways he became a figure who divided people. Many people came to love Socrates. A generation of young 20-somethings like the guy we'll focus on in later our next lecture, Plato, who is the first really important theoretician of the Western tradition, a first important writer of the written tradition. Socrates, as far as we know, wrote nothing, right? But Socrates inspired a generation and subsequent generations of thinkers to produce some amazing thought that we're going to get. We have the privilege of standing on their shoulders and wrestling with those ideas. We have the advantage, right, of wrestling with these giants in the long written tradition that we have inherited here. So Socrates inspired many, and I'd say that's very positive. He also really put a lot of people off, you know, and some of that may have been his personality, and some of that may have been his practice of speaking somewhat ironically and sarcastically at times. Some people suspected that he was a sophist. I don't really accept that theory. I don't think there's any good evidence for him having accepted money for his teachings. I think that we're going to develop a picture of Socrates as sort of a deep, deep seeker, right? Like a lover of wisdom about life. And I think that's the best way to understand Socrates and certainly his legacy. And so that puts him at odds with the sophists, who would sell their services not in pursuit of wisdom, but in some sense, and if we appeal to this darker side of sophistry, they would sell their services to the highest bidder, right? Like the sophistry serves power because it's power that can afford the best sophists. Philosophers aren't interested in power per se, or perhaps we could say it differently. Philosophers believe that wisdom is power. We're going to see that come to fruition in the teachings of Plato. Knowledge is power. Wisdom is the goal, not a high paycheck, not, you know, political or social influence, right? So in some sense, that's me creating a somewhat overly simple caricature of the sophists by leaning into their sort of darker reputation and then making that a point of contrast with Socrates, the Socrates of the story, that the standard story of his life and death. So Socrates is most famous for engaging in these conversations. More specifically, he's sort of famous for what we might call a method, a Socratic method of conversation, in which one of his favorite moves in conversation was to ask questions of people. And in particular, he came to be known for asking questions of very famous, well-known, and powerful people. And some of this, you know, sort of got put on steroids by a little catalyst episode. We think that a guy named Chaerephon, or Chaerephon, however we want to say that Greek name, an associate and friend of Socrates's, perhaps visited a very famous, arguably the most famous ancient religious site in Greece, the famous temple at Delphi, the oracle at Delphi. This temple, I believe, that was to Apollo, that had over the gates the famous watchwords, "Know thyself." And please put a pin in that, because we're going to need to come back to that over and over again. We've already seen that, I think, in the virtue theory of the Taoists, in a way. In an earlier lecture, know thyself is crucial in Greek culture, and there are many ways to take that, and we're going to definitely see that as a kind of a pattern that gets worked into the thought of the important ethical thinkers. You want to have a better life? Number one, know yourself. And not only maybe know yourself as an individual, that's the way we would take it given our very 21st century individualistic lens, but maybe I would argue more important in the search for wisdom about life that applies to all humans, know thyself in terms of what kind of creature you are, right? And I've already worked that into both my lectures so far, and that's going to be true in especially every one, I would say, of the lectures in ethics going forward. But particularly the ancient Greek ethicists. And so Socrates has his story transformed somewhat by this episode that I need to describe, where Chaerephon visits the oracle at Delphi, where "Know thyself" supposedly was the watchwords of Apollo and written over the entrance there. Now, these oracles often had these priestesses, and maybe I'll give you kind of one simple version of how this might have unfolded. These priestesses lived near maybe a cave, and that cave might have had some fumes coming out of it. These young priestesses who did not live long, in part because they were probably very high, always on fumes. These priestesses would, you'd bring them a question, and the priestesses would give some kind of very high, mysterious answer. And then the male priests attending the temple would maybe offer you kind of an interpretation of that. But as the story goes, Chaerephon got a shockingly direct answer to his question. And his question was something like, is Socrates, this old guy that I am a big fan of back in Athens, is Socrates the wisest person in Greece? And what we get back apparently from the oracle is yes. No one is wiser than Socrates. And, again, what's startling about that is the directness of the response. And so when Chaerephon apparently relates that story to Socrates, who's already maybe famous for engaging in conversations of a public figure, both loved and feared, and some actually are going to develop an antipathy to him, kind of almost a hatred of him. Socrates sees the answer as, troublingly direct, right? And, it's troubling on a couple levels. One, it's troublingly direct. So there must be a trick here, right? Because it's just not the way the oracle typically works. But secondly, Socrates, he knows himself, and he knows he's not a, well-educated guy. He doesn't know a lot. There seem to be a lot of people around him that know so much more than he does. So what's the mystery here? What is the riddle behind the answer that no one is wiser than Socrates? And so Socrates ramps up perhaps his efforts to engage in these public conversations, where he engages in what we come to call the Socratic method, where he asks questions of people in order to pull forth knowledge from people. And what he finds, and what he's hoping to find, right, is like some kind of data here that will maybe help him solve the riddle that no one is wiser than Socrates, because certainly it can't mean that, because he knows that he's not that wise and all these other people seem more wise. So he more and more begins to confront people with reputations for wisdom. And what he invariably finds, with his apparent genius for conversation and particularly for provocative and probing questions, is that he finds that almost everybody thinks they know more than they do. Particularly people with reputations for knowing a lot are notorious, it turns out. He discovers this for himself, for thinking they know things that they then can't explain when you ask them good enough questions about it. And so what transpires, right, is that the Socratic practice that becomes this sort of public sport, if you will, in the agora, where people who love and hate Socrates are watching this like some great chess match in the park. They're watching Socrates with his questions systematically dismantle the people who claim to know a lot. And again, this is going to just light a fire under so many young adult Athenians, and they're going to take this home, and they're going to take this to their parents and to their elders, and this is going to worsen in some ways the reputation of Socrates. Like, where are you getting this from, child? Why are you questioning me this way? Well, Socrates has taught me that. And add that he is publicly exposing the lack of wisdom in these individuals who have reputation for wisdom. He's doing this in front of a crowd many times. And look, I want you to imagine that you're one of these individuals with some reputation for knowledge and understanding, and a Socrates, this old, funny-looking, dirty, smelly, guy who doesn't work a lot and hangs out in the park all day and just sort of badgers people with questions is making you look like a fool with his good questions. You know, what strength of character would it take to say, thank you, old funny-looking Socrates. Thank you for helping me to realize that I don't know what I thought I knew and what everybody else thought I knew. Thank you so much. That is, I would say, psychologically rare. And by the way, let's put a pin in that just for a second, because one of the challenges to studying philosophy and especially ethics, because it's so sort of close to home in these questions we deal with about how to have a good life and what does it mean to be a good person. These are questions that are intimately related. The answers to these questions, the assumptions we already have about these questions are intimately related to our sense for ourselves, our identities, right? And so if somebody comes along and effectively dismantles our attempts to defend our ideas of a good life or anything that we think we know that's tied to our sense of ourselves and certainly our reputation, our successful reputation with others, and does this in public. I mean, even if you did this privately, the typical human response is one of psychological and emotional defensiveness. The walls go up and the firing back starts. The name calling, the insults, you funny looking old smelly dude, how dare you, right? And unfortunately, I think we all can relate to the humanity, the humanness of this story in our own relationships with friends and loved ones and significant others and roommates and family members, right? I mean, how many times have we challenged the ideas of somebody we care about, maybe even if we're, you know, kind of in a good moment, trying to help them understand something, trying to get them to see something, and we've met that wall. We've met that resistance. And Socrates, with his sarcasm and his questions in public, beating down that wall, you know, in some sense, it won't surprise you that the next part of the story is that certain powerful Athenians decide enough is enough. Now, let's add to the context here by saying that Athens has tried to push its weight around a little too much. It's dominated a certain region of the peninsula called Attica, and it's begun to try to push, and it has always tried, I think, since its golden age emerged, push its weight around even in the Peloponnese, the Peloponnesian portion of the Greek peninsula, which is dominated by Sparta. Remember those dudes in the movie 300 with the great abs? Those people. Right? And if there's somebody you don't want to like poke with a sharp stick, it's the Spartans. And Athens eventually will really, you know, rue the day that it tried to push around the Peloponnesian city-states dominated by Sparta, because eventually, I think around maybe in the 430s or so, you're going to get the emergence of the open conflict between Sparta and Athens in what's called the Peloponnesian War. Somewhat ironically, the Peloponnesian War, you could easily call it the Attican War, because it's really, I would think in some ways, instigated by the sort of imperial aspirations of Athens. But the context here I want to develop is that decades, literally, of Peloponnesian struggle here, or Athenian struggle with Sparta, is going to lead to some very dark times and the sort of crashing of the Athenian economy. And all of this is the context within which Socrates is at the height of his game, challenging the power structures of Athens with these public questions. And, you know, there's even going to be a plague, right, that's going to take the life of one of the most famous democratic leaders of Athens, Pericles. And eventually, when the Spartans sort of vanquish the Athenian military, they're going to, I think they're going to burn the fleet, the naval fleet, they're going to tear down the walls, and the economic and military power of Athens will be gutted. I think it's interesting to note, and you'll see this going forward in our lecture series, that the power of Athens culturally will remain intact. And it's a little interesting that philosophy and the cultural rise of Athens is associated with its golden age, but even after its economic and military demise, where it's sort of put back into the place of being just one city-state among many, no longer a little regional superpower, it's almost going to become more interesting in terms of its cultural influence. I'll develop that in the next couple of lectures. And within the context of the collapsing military and economic power of Athens, Socrates is at the height of his game. And so, this also involves, by the way, one more layer here, the Spartans putting in place a kind of a set of families to rule over the democratically inclined Athenians in what was called, I think, the 30, and then the Athenians, doing away with the 30 and reinstituting democracy in Athens. And here's Socrates doing his thing. And, so charitably, there may have been people who thought that Socrates was a disruptive figure in a time where Athenian democracy was fragile. I think less charitably, there were just a lot of very powerful people who felt very exposed and vulnerable in this moment, who were seeing themselves publicly humiliated by a clever old man who, in many respects, was doing nothing other than trying to be what he described in his trial as a midwife, right? As trying to help people to give birth to their own understanding through his questioning conversational style. And more often than not, the result of that was, for most people who think they know more than they do, his conversational style focusing on probing questions, this what's become known as the Socratic method, as almost a teaching method, would draw forth understanding to the edge of understanding and expose then the absence of understanding on the other side of that edge. What is sometimes called the non-knowledge, the lack of knowledge, the negative wisdom, as in the absence of wisdom. And so Socrates saw himself as this midwife, trying to help people give birth to their own self-understanding, helping people to know themselves. And this was in some sense the answer to the riddle, right? I mean, Socrates knew he wasn't wise, but at least he knew he wasn't wise, and most people thought they were more wise than they were. And so when Socrates is put on trial, he's put on trial for two things: corrupting the youth, and I think I've given you some sense for how that unfolded, and I think that's the more serious charge, and then the less serious, more trumped up charge, worshiping false deities, impiety. The Athenians were, they had, gods, and they had, a central goddess, Athena, that was worshipped, in the special temple on top of the Acropolis. But the Athenians were all about the business. They were all about, trade, and like any cosmopolitan trade-based city-state, they were pretty open-minded. You had to work pretty hard to run afoul of like Athenian religious culture. But what you're going to see a pattern here is that many philosophers who dare to ask deep enough questions of existence and do it publicly enough and have enough influence, they're often going to be the ones that get called up on these charges of impiety, including Socrates. Now, the essence of that charge, it would seem, is that Socrates supposedly had a voice that he often heard. Sometimes sounds a bit like a conscience, but it was a little bit more tangible than that. He said he'd always heard this voice. It always guided him, especially toward what he should not do. And so his opponents, right, who were bringing these charges, probably just trying to shut the old guy up in this historical moment, just want him to shut up or go away, are saying that he's worshiping false gods by making up deities. But Socrates is going to run circles around them with his rhetorical, conversational abilities. And we see this in the writing called Apology by Plato. And this is the most famous version of how the trial may have gone down. It was a very big sort of public trial, and the juries for the Athenians were like 500 people. This was a big deal, right? And And Socrates is going to say, well, things like, hey, I don't have any skills. These people are going to make me forget who I am. They're so good at talking, but I'm going to speak plainly and just give you the truth. And then he goes on to just like demolish, right? Like this charge of impiety. He walks them right into the several contradictions where they seem to charge him with worshiping false deities and charge him with atheism, not believing in deities at all. And he just makes a fool of his accusers in this regard. But the more serious charge, right, is this charge, I think, of corrupting the youth. And while Socrates offers somewhat of a defense, most everybody knows of Socrates. He's a very famous figure at this point. He's already made his way into very famous plays. Theater was huge in ancient Greece, and he'd already been mocked as a caricature in the famous play by Aristophanes called The Clouds. And, so And Socrates knows this, right? And so he'll engage in a little bit of sophistry, I think, when he says things like, I won't bring my kids here and beg for your mercy. I have kids, but I won't bring them here. He, in some sense, just did bring them there in the mind of the jury. And he also just says, look, my challenge is going to be these silver-tongued devils over here who he just ran circles around. And my challenge is going to be your assumptions about me. Very clever move, right? Very accurate in a way, because so many people in the jury are sort of already maybe afraid or leery or nervous about Socrates, suspicious about Socrates. He had a little guilt by association by his connection to a guy named Alcibiades, who had turned out to be kind of who sided with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War at some point after being a very famous Athenian, and had maybe been a lover of Socrates's, certainly an associate of Socrates's. So, a lot of people were suspicious of Socrates, and he's going to try to deal with this, but the way in which he deals with this in his trial, if Plato and also Xenophon's version of this are to be believed, is that he offers a kind of a defense that is in some sense no defense. What he's going to do is he's going to at some point kind of turn on the jury itself. And, I'll caricature this for you, and you could read this for yourself in Plato's Apology, which I've assigned to you. But it's basically going to be something like, my challenge is going to be your unquestioned assumptions about me and about life. And all I'm really ever trying to do is not corrupt anybody. I'm trying to improve people. I'm trying to help people to understand themselves and to think just a little bit about what makes life worth living. And most of you are so caught up in like money and politics and power and fashion and superficial bullshit, right? That you don't spend any time thinking about the things that matter most, and you resent this old guy for wanting you to do it more. And so, at this point, right, Socrates' defense of himself, which, by the way, the word apology doesn't mean I'm sorry, and he clearly didn't say I'm sorry. Apology in the older sense of the term apologetics is a defense, right? And yet his defense of his actions, while present in what he says, ends up sort of focusing on the jury and the way in which the jury is living, to use the most famous line of the Apology, and maybe one of the most famous lines of Western philosophy in general. His defense castigates the jury and the public that is present for living unexamined lives, for living lives where they don't think for themselves and really consider the things that matter. And he says the unexamined life is not worth living. And I want you to let that set in for a second, especially those of you who maybe wrote in your first discussion posts in our course, that you never really thought about these matters before. That would come across as pretty darn judgy, right? The unexamined life is not worth living. Like your life is not even worth a life. Now, I totally get, and I'm almost trying to mimic the sort of angry somewhat defensive response that would come from the jury, that could come from us now, right? And this is one of the challenges of doing philosophy that I was trying to talk about before. Psychological and emotional defensiveness is going to emerge for us in this course. That is the typical human response. We tend to be deeply identified with our beliefs. And when somebody challenges our beliefs with something different or a critique of our beliefs, we often withdraw and just shoot back from behind a wall. By the way, this is one very interesting reason for considering deeply the points that I tried to make in the lecture on Taoism, which is if you could practice non-labeling and non-judgment as a part of your weekly or daily routine, maybe you could drop your sense of yourself out of your thoughts and into something deeper. And if you have a deeper sense of self, other than what you currently believe, you are perhaps more psychologically ready to reconsider what you believe. And I think that's a virtue, right? Like that's an excellence. That's a habit which we could cultivate in ourselves that would lead us to more adaptive existences and a more of a facility to contribute positively to the way in which our culture needs to adapt, the way in which our familial and religious and political and social and economic traditions must evolve. And as we'll get to at the end of the course, in some sense, as Nietzsche will point out to us, you know, the experiment must be conducted by the individual. And so if we're all running around sort of unconsciously identified with our thoughts, when a Socratic influence comes into our lives, whether it's a book or something we hear or learn, you know, a teaching, a philosophy like we're going to go through in this course, you know, pulling from these giant influential thinkers, when that comes into our lives, what do? We put up the wall and we guard our current beliefs. And then we go and hide in these strange bubbles on the internet where we can find other people who agree with us already and reinforce the rightness of our current position and just get more and more entrenched and less able to dialogue and to compromise and to adapt and to think critically about the ideas that matter most. And this is exactly right what Socrates, sort of wagging his finger at the jury about, you know, does as his defense. And look, Xenophon speculates in his apology, his version of the trial, that if Socrates had been 30 years old, maybe he wouldn't have played it that way. But Socrates was 70. 71. This is 399. He was born in roughly 470. And he is in some ways not clinging to life. And he's never, it would seem like from his behavior, sought money or power or reputation. And that's part of what he says at his trial. I've never been about the money. I've never been about fame or popularity. I've always just been trying to help. And I'm not in this moment going to put my tail between my legs and slink away like these accusers want me to, and like many of you would have me do, because I'm a gadfly. I am a stinging bug, right? Stinging your complacent, lazy butt, Athens, right? Stinging this great horse into action. That, you know, he uses this metaphor in his defense. You know, I'm doing you a favor. And I'm not going to stop. And so by a fairly or surprisingly narrow margin, he's convicted. And in the second phase of the trial, each side has to promote a penalty, right? And you're basically supposed to say something like a little extreme this way and then a little extreme this way, and then hopefully find some kind of middle ground. And Socrates' accusers go extreme. They think they've won the day, having just, you know, gotten, wow, we did it. You know, I mean, they just got circles run around them. They must have looked like fools to anybody who really knew what they were watching. But but they must have felt pretty good because they won the thing and they were emboldened, and they said, death, execution. Nothing less than execution for this guy who corrupts our young people to be disrespectful of Athenian ways and Athenian authorities. This person who's making up gods and doesn't believe in the right gods. Execution is what he deserves. And Socrates says, well, okay, so now you want me to tell you what I think I deserve as a punishment? Look, I have to be honest. I've always only been honest with you. I'll tell you what I think I deserve. I think that you should treat me at least as well as you treat the Olympic athletes that you honor in the Prytaneum. There was this place where the winners of the Olympics, the Greek Olympics, the athletes, and perhaps others, I don't know, were honored and sort of given, like access to like literally free meals. And so Socrates is basically saying, you should honor me like you honor the athletes. And, I want you, here's another moment from ancient Greece, right, that should sound a little resonant with our contemporary culture. And that's not me knocking amazing elite athletes, right? But does it ever seem a little out of balance to you how much emphasis in our culture we place on the lives and the successes of these athletes, even at times when they're suspect people, right? And so Socrates says, you should treat me at least as well as you treat these athletes. And so how about free lunch for the rest of my life? That should be the punishment. Now, maybe what happens next is that some people who love Socrates maybe almost shout out, like, this is Socrates committing death by jury, right? And so maybe some people that love Socrates shout out at this moment, he doesn't mean that, he means a fine. And Socrates, like, if he wasn't wearing a Greek chiton, if he had some trousers on, right, he could pull out his pockets and say, what money? I've never sought money, right? Like, I was never in this for the money. I was never in this for the power. I don't have the money, but if they're going to put forth, okay, a certain amount, whatever it is, a certain amount of minae or whatever the Greek money was at the time, it was a paltry little pittance, but the damage, right, had been done. Not only in the attitude he'd given during his trial phase, but now the attitude that he had shown in his sentencing phase. A larger number of people then voted to condemn him to death. And Socrates finishes, very elegantly and very bravely, apparently, again, written by Plato, so it's tough to say, but I think the ideas are worth wrestling with in of themselves, where he, basically says, okay, I'm not surprised. Now we part ways. Do me a favor. Will you keep my kids in line and pester them as I have pestered you? I think that's a pretty interesting line, right? Like, will you do to my children what I have done to you? I mean, to the end, right? He's being true to, it seems like, his principle. And in some sense, this is Socrates becoming, whether true or not, the symbolic martyr of the examined life. Staying true to it right to the end. And he even goes on to say at the very end, by the way, we part ways now, you to live and I to die, and we'll see. Time will tell which one is better. The life that is ignorant and lacks self-awareness, or frankly, just to make peace with, having lived a long life already, doing what you loved in the place that you loved, and just being willing to say, okay, fine. I love Athens. I actually love all of y'all. You say death, and I accept death. And, that completes our exploration of Socrates as a figure. Probably present at the trial, right, we think, is this number one witness of Plato. And Plato is one of these He's going to be a 20-something, 27, 28-year-old grown man from a very influential and wealthy family in Athens, deeply, deeply motivated to defend Socrates, and deeply inspired by what he has experienced in the life and now the death of Socrates. That's going to be the next chapter in Western ethics. And so we'll see that in our next lecture. I hope you guys are well. Stay safe and sane, and I'll see you for the next lecture.